The morning sun peeked through the blinds of the Sunshine Diner, casting golden stripes across the one counter. Sheila Jackson wiped her hands on her apron and glanced at the clock. 6:30. Like clockwork, she had arrived an hour before opening to prep the coffee machines and set out the day's fresh pies. After nearly 10 years working at the same diner, Sheila had her routine down pat. "Morning, Miss Sheila," called out Tom, the cook, as he pushed through the swinging kitchen doors. "Ready for another Tuesday?" Sheila smiled, the small wrinkles around her eyes deepening. At 53, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had seen her fair share of life's challenges but refused to be beaten down by them. "Aren't I always?" she replied, filling the sugar dispensers with practiced efficiency. "Got a feeling it might be a good one today." She couldn't have known how right she would be. The morning rush came and went as usual. The regulars, mostly factory workers grabbing breakfast before their shifts and retirees meeting for their daily gossip sessions, filled the booths and counter seats. Sheila moved between tables with an easy grace, remembering everyone's usual order and asking about children and grandchildren by name. It was just after the morning rush had died down when the bell above the door jingled. Sheila looked up to see a woman in a wheelchair struggling to maneuver through the entrance. Without hesitation, she set down the coffee pot and hurried over. "Here, let me help you with that door," Sheila said, holding it wide. These old buildings weren't made with wheels in mind. The woman looked up, surprise flickering across her face. She had soft gray eyes that seemed tired around the edges and light brown hair cut in a simple bob. Sheila guessed she was in her mid-40s, though something about her, perhaps the slight tremble in her hands or the cautious way she surveyed the room, made her seem older. "Thank you," the woman said quietly. I haven't been out to eat in a while." Sheila nodded, understanding in her eyes. She'd seen that look before. The nervous uncertainty of someone who wasn't sure if they belonged in a space. "Well, you picked a good place to start. I'm Sheila, and I've been serving folks here since before some of these tables got their last coat of varnish." She glanced around the diner. "Now, would you prefer a table by the window? Gets nice morning light, and you can watch the world go by while you eat." The woman's shoulders relaxed slightly. "That sounds perfect. I'm Margaret Wilson." Sheila led Margaret to the corner table by the big front window, clearing away an extra chair to make room for the wheelchair. As she did, she noticed the wheelchair wasn't one of those sleek, lightweight models she sometimes saw. This one was bulkier, medical-looking, the kind provided by insurance companies more concerned with function than comfort. "Let me grab you a menu," Sheila said, but paused when she saw Margaret struggling to remove her gloves. Her fingers seemed stiff, uncooperative. Without drawing attention to it, Sheila slowed down, giving Margaret time to complete the task before setting the menu down. "Our special today is blueberry pancakes, but between you and me," Sheila leaned in conspiratorially, "Tom's eggs are his real talent. He does them just right, not too runny, not too firm." Margaret's face brightened slightly at Sheila's friendly manner. "Eggs sound wonderful. 2 over easy, with wheat toast if you have it. And just black coffee, please." "Coming right up," Sheila said, jotting down the order. As she turned to leave, she noticed Margaret looking around the diner with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. There was something in that look that tugged at Sheila's heart. A loneliness she recognized all too well. When Sheila brought the coffee, she set it down carefully within easy reach. Without being asked, she opened 2 sugar packets and placed them beside the cup, along with a spoon that had a slightly wider handle than the others. It was a small gesture, but Margaret noticed. "How did you know?" she asked, looking at the sugar packets. Sheila smiled. "My sister had arthritis, something terrible in her later years. Little things like sugar packets became her worst enemy. She didn't mention that her sister had passed 5 years ago. Some details didn't need sharing yet." As Margaret ate her breakfast, Sheila checked on her regularly, refilling her coffee and making light conversation. She learned that Margaret had moved to town recently, that she lived alone in a small house on Maple Street, and that this was her first time venturing out to a restaurant since moving. "Well, now you've found us, you'll have to come back," Sheila said warmly as she brought the check. "Tuesday mornings are quiet like this. Good for when you want some peace with your breakfast." Margaret looked up from her empty plate. "I might just do that. For the first time that morning, she smiled fully, and Sheila could see the person beneath the hesitancy, someone with warmth in her eyes and stories to tell. When Margaret left, leaving a generous tip despite what Sheila suspected were limited means, Sheila found herself watching through the window as the woman carefully navigated her wheelchair down the sidewalk. There was something about Margaret that stayed with her throughout the day, a quiet dignity that reminded Sheila of her own mother. Sure enough, the following Friday Margaret returned, and then again the next Tuesday. Each time, Sheila saved the corner table, opening sugar packets without being asked and making sure the path to the restroom was clear of chairs. There were small kindnesses, so small that most people wouldn't notice them. But Margaret did. By the fourth visit, Sheila didn't even need to take Margaret's order. 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, black coffee. She started bringing extra napkins without being asked after noticing that Margaret sometimes had trouble with spills. When Margaret fumbled in her purse for her wallet one morning, clearly flustered, Sheila pretended not to notice, giving her extra time. "You know, in all my years coming here, nobody's treated me as kindly as you do," one of the regulars commented to Sheila after watching her interaction with Margaret. "That woman's lucky to have found this place." Sheila shook her head as she wiped down the counter. "It's nothing special. Just treating folks like I'd want to be treated." But it was special to Margaret. That became clear when, 6 weeks after her first visit, she arrived with a small, wrapped package for Sheila. "It's not much," Margaret said, pushing the package across the table with slightly trembling hands. "But I wanted you to know what these mornings have meant to me." Inside was a handmade bookmark with pressed flowers. At the bottom, in somewhat shaky handwriting, were the words, "Kindness matters. Thank you for yours." Sheila didn't know then that this was just the beginning. She couldn't have guessed that the quiet woman in the wheelchair would become one of the most important people in her life, or that their Tuesday and Friday ritual would lead to a friendship that would change them both forever. All she knew was that something important had begun that ordinary Tuesday morning, as simple as eggs over easy and as profound as being seen for who you really are. The seasons changed outside the Sunshine Diner's big front window. Summer heat gave way to autumn Christmas, and Margaret's corner table became her twice-weekly refuge. Sheila began to notice the little things about her quiet customer, things most people would miss. On rainy days, Margaret would arrive with her coat sleeve damp from pushing her wheelchair through puddles. Without making a fuss, Sheila would bring a clean towel along with the coffee. "Just in case," she'd say, placing it within reach. Margaret would smile gratefully, never having to explain. It was the small struggles that caught Sheila's attention most. The way Margaret's fingers sometimes trembled too much to tear open the sugar packets. How she would occasionally drop her fork and look embarrassed when it clattered to the floor. The slight wince when she reached into her purse to find her wallet. "You remind me of my grandmother," Sheila told her one slow Tuesday morning as she refilled Margaret's coffee cup. She never complained, not once, even when things got hard for her. Used to say complaining was just wasting breath that could be used for laughing instead. Margaret looked up, surprise in her grey eyes. "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman." "Oh, she was something else," Sheila chuckled, leaning against the adjacent table. "Raised 7 children in a 2-bedroom house and still managed to have the neighborhood kids over for cookies every Thursday. Never met a problem she couldn't tackle with a good night's sleep and a fresh perspective." For the first time, Margaret shared something personal in return. "My mother was the opposite, worried about everything. If it wasn't the weather, it was money. If it wasn't money, it was what the neighbors would think." She smiled sadly. "I promised myself I'd never live that way, always afraid." And then, she gestured vaguely to her wheelchair. Sheila nodded, understanding the unspoken. Life had its own plans sometimes. The diner was empty except for an elderly man reading his newspaper at the counter, so Sheila took a risk. "Do you mind if I sit a minute?" Margaret's face brightened. "Please do." And so began a new routine within their routine. During quiet moments, Sheila would sit with Margaret, just for a few minutes. They'd share snippets of their lives between Sheila's other duties, nothing too deep at first, just the gentle getting to know you of new friends. One Friday morning in November, Margaret fumbled in her purse longer than usual when the check came. Her face flushed with embarrassment as she searched each pocket. "I can't believe this," she whispered, distress evident in her voice. I must have left my wallet at home. Before Margaret could say another word, Sheila waved her hand dismissively. Don't you worry about that for 1 second. It happens to everyone. But I can't just. You'll get it next time, Sheila said firmly, removing the check from the table. Or you won't. Either way, the world keeps spinning. Margaret's eyes welled with tears. I don't know what to say. Nothing needs saying, Sheila replied simply. That's what folks do for each other. The following Tuesday, Margaret arrived with exact change for her previous meal, plus extra. Sheila accepted the money for the meal, but handed back the extra. That's not how friendship works, she said quietly. After that day, something shifted between them. Their conversations deepened. Margaret shared how she'd been a 4th grade teacher before a car accident 5 years ago left her partially paralyzed. Sheila told Margaret about raising her 3 children alone after her husband died unexpectedly at 42. Robert Jr. just finished his 2nd year of community college, Sheila said proudly one morning, showing Margaret a photo of her oldest son in a graduation cap. First in our family to go. Works nights stocking shelves to pay for it. You must be so proud, Margaret said, studying the photo. Proud doesn't begin to cover it, Sheila replied, carefully returning the photo to her apron pocket. What about you? Any family nearby? Margaret shook her head. My parents passed years ago. No siblings. I had a cat until last year. She smiled wryly. Not much of a family, I guess. Sheila touched Margaret's hand briefly. Family isn't always who you're born to. Sometimes it's who you find along the way. The winter brought heavy snow, and Margaret missed several of her regular visits. Sheila found herself watching the door on Tuesdays and Fridays, feeling a pang of worry when Margaret didn't appear. The corner table seemed emptier somehow. When Margaret finally returned in January, Sheila noticed immediate changes. Her clothes hung looser on her frame. The tremor in her hands seemed worse. There were dark circles under her eyes. Been wondering where you'd disappeared to, Sheila said, pouring coffee without being asked. She added a splash of cream, something she'd never done before. Thought you might need a little extra today, she explained when Margaret looked surprised. The snow makes it hard to get around, Margaret explained, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. My driveway doesn't get plowed, and in this chair, she trailed off. You need someone to help clear it for you, Sheila asked. Margaret shook her head. I'm fine, really, just a bit of winter blues. But Sheila could tell it was more than that. She noticed how Margaret's coat had a small tear in the sleeve that had been mended inexpertly. How she ordered only toast and coffee, skipping her usual eggs. The way she seemed to count out her tipped coins carefully, as if each one mattered. One morning, Margaret's hands shook so badly that she spilled coffee across the table. Mortified, she tried to clean it up, but her napkin quickly became soaked, making a bigger mess. I'm so sorry, she kept saying, her face flushed with embarrassment. Sheila cleaned it up efficiently, making light of the situation. If this is the worst thing that happens today, we're both doing just fine, she said with a wink. That afternoon, after her shift ended, Sheila did something she'd never done before. She wrote down Margaret's address from the credit card receipt she'd kept and drove her old blue Chevy to the small house on Maple Street. She sat in her car for a long moment, wondering if she was overstepping. But something told her that Margaret needed help she wasn't asking for. And if there was one thing Sheila's grandmother had taught her, it was to trust that feeling in your gut when it told you someone needed a hand. The walkway to Margaret's front door hadn't been shoveled. In places, the snow reached halfway up Sheila's calf. She couldn't imagine how Margaret navigated this in her wheelchair. As she stood on the front porch, hand raised to knock, Sheila didn't know that this simple act, checking on a customer who'd become a friend, would change both their lives forever. All she knew was that no one should have to face their struggles alone, especially not someone who smiled so gratefully over a simple cup of coffee. Sheila's knuckles hovered over Margaret's front door for a moment before she knocked. The sound seemed to echo in the winter stillness. No answer came. She knocked again, louder this time. Margaret, it's Sheila from the diner. She heard a faint noise from inside, then the slow squeak of wheelchair wheels. The door opened just a crack at first, then wider as Margaret recognized her visitor. Sheila. Margaret's voice was a mixture of surprise and embarrassment. What are you doing here? Standing on the threshold, Sheila suddenly wondered if she'd made a mistake. Maybe Margaret valued her privacy more than Sheila had realized. But then she saw past Margaret into the dim house, and her doubts vanished. The living room was freezing cold. A single lamp lit the space, and Margaret was bundled in what looked like several sweaters and a blanket across her lap. A small space heater glowed orange near her wheelchair, clearly the only source of heat. "I was worried about you," Sheila said honestly. "Thought I'd check in, see if you needed anything." Margaret's face flushed. "You shouldn't have. The place is a mess. I wasn't expecting company." But Sheila was already stepping inside, stamping snow from her boots. "I'm not company. I'm just me." She glanced around, taking in the situation without judgment. "Mind if I warm up a bit before heading back out? That wind is something fierce today." It was a kind fiction, giving Margaret a chance to maintain her dignity. After a hesitation, Margaret wheeled back from the doorway. "Of course. I can make some tea." "Let me," Sheila offered, following Margaret to the tiny kitchen. What she saw there made her heart sink. The refrigerator, when Margaret opened it, contained little more than half a carton of milk, some butter, and a few apples. The cupboards weren't much better. As Sheila waited for the kettle to boil, she noticed other things. The thermostat on the wall was set to 55 degrees. Multiple blankets were piled on the couch. Bills were stacked on the kitchen table, some marked "Final Notice" in bold red letters. "Margaret," she said gently, setting 2 mugs of tea on the table. "What's going on? And don't tell me it's just winter blues." For a long moment, Margaret stared into her mug. When she looked up, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I didn't want anyone to know," she whispered. "It's humiliating." "There's no shame in needing help," Sheila said. "Lord knows I've needed it myself plenty of times." The words seemed to break something open in Margaret. The story came out in halting sentences. After her accident, insurance had covered many of her medical bills, but not everything. Her disability payments barely covered her mortgage. The heating system had broken down in November, and the repair estimate was more than she had in her savings. "I've been using the space heater, moving it from room to room," she explained. "And lots of blankets." "What about family? Friends?" Sheila asked. Margaret shook her head. "I told you there's no family. And friends," she sighed. "People drift away when your life becomes complicated. They don't mean to, but they do." Sheila reached across the table and took Margaret's cold hand in her warm one. "Not all people." That evening, Sheila didn't go home until she'd made sure Margaret had a proper meal, brought from her own freezer stash of homemade soup, the space heater was safely positioned in her bedroom, and extra blankets were piled on her bed. "I'll be back tomorrow after my shift," she said firmly as she prepared to leave. "And I'm bringing my son David. He's good with fixing things. Maybe he can take a look at your heating system." Margaret started to protest, but Sheila cut her off with a wave of her hand. "You can't change my mind, so don't waste your energy trying." The next day, Sheila arrived with not only David, but also a trunk full of groceries and her youngest son Peter, who was on break from his first year of college. David, a stocky young man with his mother's kind eyes, immediately set to work examining the ancient furnace in the basement. Peter, lanky and a bit shy, began clearing the snowy walkway and driveway without being asked. "You don't have to do this," Margaret said to Sheila as they unpacked groceries in the kitchen. "I know I don't have to," Sheila replied. "I want to. That's what makes it different." By evening, David had coaxed the old furnace back to life. "Just a faulty igniter switch and some cleaning," he explained, and Peter had not only cleared the snow, but also spread salt on the walkway. As they all sat around Margaret's small kitchen table eating pizza that Sheila had insisted on ordering, Margaret looked around in wonder. Her house felt warm for the first time in weeks, both from the repaired heating system and from the presence of people who cared. "I don't know how to thank you all," she said, her voice thick with emotion. David shrugged, smiling. "Mom told us about your famous apple pie. That seems like thanks enough to me." Margaret laughed, a real laugh, her first in a long time. "It's been ages since I baked anything." "Well, now your kitchen's stocked and your oven works," Sheila pointed out. "No time like the present." Over the next few weeks, a new routine developed. Sheila still served Margaret breakfast at the diner on Tuesdays and Fridays, but now she also stopped by the house every few days, sometimes with one of her children, sometimes alone. They tackled small repairs together, fixing a leaky faucet, replacing a broken door handle, installing grab bars in the bathroom. Margaret, for her part, rediscovered her love of baking. The first apple pie was indeed made for David, who declared it the best he'd ever tasted. Soon she was experimenting with different recipes, always making enough to share with Sheila and her family. One evening, as they sat in Margaret's now warm living room sharing slices of lemon cake, Margaret asked the question that had been on her mind. "Why are you doing all this for me, Sheila? We barely knew each other a few months ago." Sheila considered the question, then answered with the simple truth. "When my husband died, I was drowning. 3 kids, 2 jobs, and a mountain of medical bills. I was too proud to ask for help, too stubborn to admit I couldn't do it alone." She took a sip of her tea before continuing. "My neighbor Mrs. Chen started bringing dinner every Wednesday, just showed up at my door with enough food for all of us. When I tried to thank her, she just said, 'Today you, tomorrow me.' I never forgot that." Margaret nodded slowly, understanding. "Besides," Sheila added with a smile, "you're the only person besides me who knows that Tom's scrambled eggs are better than his omelets. That makes us practically family." The two women laughed together, the sound filling the small house with something that had been missing for too long: joy. Neither of them could have predicted where their friendship would lead next, but in that moment, sitting together in the warm light of Margaret's lamp, the future looked brighter than it had in years. Spring arrived with a burst of color in Margaret's small front yard. The crocuses Sheila had planted last fall poked their purple and yellow heads through the soil, bringing a smile to Margaret's face whenever she looked out her living room window. "You've got a green thumb," Margaret remarked one April afternoon as Sheila knelt in the flower bed, pulling early weeds. "These flowers are thriving." Sheila sat back on her heels, wiping her brow with the back of her gardening glove. "My grandmother taught me. She could grow roses in a concrete parking lot, I swear." She patted the soil around a budding daffodil. "There's something healing about putting your hands in the dirt. Reminds you that new things can always grow." Over the past few months, their friendship had deepened into something neither woman had expected. What began as casual breakfast conversations had transformed into genuine companionship. 3 or 4 evenings a week, Sheila would stop by after her shift at the diner. Sometimes they'd watch old movies together, laughing at the same funny scenes. Other times, they'd simply sit and talk, sharing stories from their lives. Margaret had begun teaching Sheila's youngest son, Peter, how to bake. Every Sunday afternoon, he'd come over with new recipes he wanted to try. Margaret would guide him through the process from her wheelchair, showing him how to measure precisely, how to tell when a cake was done by the smell in the kitchen. "You're good with him," Sheila observed one Sunday as Peter proudly carried his freshly baked chocolate cake out to the car. He never had patience for anything before. Now he's talking about culinary school after he finishes community college. Margaret blushed at the praise. "He's a natural. I'm just giving him a few pointers." But Sheila knew it was more than that. Margaret had a gift for teaching, for seeing the potential in others. It was a gift that had been wasted since her accident forced her early retirement. One rainy Tuesday morning, Margaret didn't show up for her usual breakfast at the diner. Sheila tried not to worry. Sometimes Margaret had doctor appointments or physical therapy sessions. But when she called during her lunch break and got no answer, concern gnawed at her stomach. "I'm taking my 15, she told Tom, untying her apron. She drove the 5 minutes to Margaret's house with her windshield wipers beating a worried rhythm. Margaret's car was in the driveway, but no lights shone from the windows despite the gloomy day. Sheila knocked, then used the spare key Margaret had given her for emergencies to open the door. "Margaret," she called, stepping inside. The house was quiet except for the patter of rain on the roof. She found Margaret in the bathroom, still in her nightgown, slumped against the wall beside her wheelchair. Her face was pale, eyes closed, breathing shallow. "Margaret." Sheila knelt beside her, heart pounding. "Can you hear me?" Margaret's eyelids fluttered. "Sheila." Her voice was weak, confused. "I was trying to. The chair slipped. I can't get up." "How long have you been here?" Sheila asked, already pulling out her phone to call an ambulance. "Since last night," Margaret whispered. I tried to reach the phone. The next few hours passed in a blur of emergency room lights and concerned doctor voices. Margaret had developed pneumonia, made worse by lying on the cold bathroom floor for hours. Her body temperature had dropped dangerously low. If Sheila hadn't found her when she did, Sheila refused to think about that possibility as she sat beside Margaret's hospital bed, watching the steady rise and fall of her chest beneath the thin blanket. She had called her children to let them know she wouldn't be home, then settled in for the night, determined not to leave Margaret alone. When the doctor came by on morning rounds, his expression was serious as he reviewed Margaret's chart. The pneumonia is responding to antibiotics, he explained, but unconcerned about her overall condition. Her blood work shows significant vitamin deficiencies, and she's underweight for her height and age. He looked at Sheila over his glasses. Has she been eating properly? She has since I've known her, Sheila replied defensively. Then, more honestly, but there were some rough patches this winter. Money's been tight for her. The doctor nodded without judgment. And what about her home situation? She'll need someone to help her when she's discharged. Does she live alone? Yes, but Sheila paused, realizing suddenly how precarious Margaret's situation truly was. I can help. My kids and I, we've been looking after her. That's good, the doctor said, making a note in the chart. But she needs more consistent care. Even with the best intentions, part-time help might not be enough. He lowered his voice. Has she considered assisted living? There are some good facilities that accept Medicare. The suggestion hit Sheila like a slap. Margaret in one of those places? The thought of her friend in a sterile room with strangers caring for her basic needs, it felt wrong. Margaret loved her little house with its garden and kitchen where she baked pies for Peter. Her independence was everything to her. She wouldn't want that, Sheila said firmly. There has to be another way. After the doctor left, Sheila sat holding Margaret's thin hand, her mind racing. The hospital room was quiet except for the beeping of monitors and the occasional announcement over the PA system. Outside the window, spring rain continued to fall, washing the world clean. As Margaret slept, Sheila found herself thinking about possibilities. Her own house was small, just 3 bedrooms for herself and her 2 sons still living at home. David would be moving out soon to marry his longtime girlfriend, but even then, the stairs would make it impossible for Margaret to navigate in her wheelchair. She thought about Margaret's house, with its narrow hallways and bathroom doorway that barely fit the wheelchair. It wasn't ideal either. And Margaret's savings were dwindling. Sheila had seen the bills, had helped Margaret set up payment plans for the most pressing ones. A memory surfaced suddenly of her grandmother's voice saying, "When you can't see a way forward, it's because you're looking at the problem from only one angle. Step to the side, child. Look again." Sheila closed her eyes, thinking, "Step to the side. Look again." When Margaret woke hours later, she found Sheila still sitting beside her, but with a strange expression on her face, the look of someone who has made a momentous decision. "What is it?" Margaret asked, her voice still weak from the pneumonia. Sheila squeezed her hand, smiling. "Just thinking. You focus on getting better. We can talk about it when you're home." But inside, Sheila's mind was already racing ahead. She knew what she needed to do. It would take time, resources, and more courage than she'd needed in years. But when it came to helping the people you cared about, some decisions made themselves. Margaret came home from the hospital 5 days later, still weak but improving. Sheila had taken time off from the diner to help with the transition, setting up a makeshift bedroom in Margaret's living room so she wouldn't have to navigate the narrow hallway to her bedroom. "You don't have to sleep on my couch," Margaret protested as Sheila arranged blankets and pillows. "David or Peter could stay instead. You've already done so much." "Those boys can't tell the difference between medicine and vitamins," Sheila replied with a smile. "Besides, I don't mind. My back's used to that old couch by now." The truth was, Sheila didn't want to leave Margaret alone, not even for one night. The image of her friend lying helpless on the bathroom floor haunted her. What if it happened again when no one was around to help? For 2 weeks, Sheila split her time between the diner and Margaret's house. She'd work the morning shift, then hurry over to make lunch, help with physical therapy exercises, and prepare dinner. At night, she'd sleep lightly on the couch, waking at the smallest sound to check if Margaret needed anything. Her boss at the diner, a gruff but kind-hearted man named Joe, noticed the strain in her face. "You're running yourself ragged, Sheila," he said one morning as she yawned over the coffee pot. "Can't those kids of yours help out more?" "They're doing what they can," Sheila defended. "David's working overtime at the garage to save for his wedding, and Peter's got finals coming up." Joe scratched his beard thoughtfully. "Well, something's got to give. You can't be in two places at once." His words echoed in Sheila's mind as she drove to Margaret's house that afternoon. Something's got to give. The temporary arrangement they had couldn't last forever. Margaret was improving, but the doctor had been clear she needed ongoing support, especially after this setback. That evening, after helping Margaret take a shower and change into fresh pajamas, Sheila sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and a notepad. She began writing numbers, calculating expenses, considering possibilities. The decision she'd made in the hospital room was taking shape now, becoming something concrete. When Margaret wheeled herself into the kitchen for breakfast the next morning, she found Sheila still at the table, surrounded by papers, her eyes tired but bright with determination. "Have you been up all night?" Margaret asked, concerned. Sheila looked up, seeming almost surprised to see her. "Just working out some details." She quickly gathered the papers into a pile. "How about some eggs? You need protein to keep getting stronger." Over the next few days, Sheila made several phone calls from Margaret's kitchen when she thought her friend was napping. She spoke in hushed tones to her son David, to a bank loan officer, and once to a contractor who came by to check the roof, but spent more time measuring doorways and discussing wheelchair access. Margaret noticed these mysterious activities, but didn't press for explanations. There was something both comforting and unsettling about Sheila taking charge this way. Comforting because, for the first time in years, Margaret felt truly cared for. Unsettling because she feared becoming a burden, the very thing she had fought so hard to avoid since her accident. One sunny afternoon, almost a month after Margaret's hospitalization, Sheila arrived later than usual. When she finally walked through the door, there was a nervous energy about her that Margaret hadn't seen before. "Sorry I'm late," Sheila said, setting down her purse. "Had some errands to run after my shift." She hesitated, then added, "Actually, I need to talk to you about something important." Margaret felt a flicker of anxiety. Was this it? The moment when Sheila would gently explain that she couldn't continue helping, that the burden was too great. "Let's sit out back," Sheila suggested. "It's too nice to stay cooped up inside." In the small backyard, spring was in full bloom. The rose bushes David had planted were budding, and birds chirped in the old maple tree. Sheila helped Margaret navigate her wheelchair over the slightly uneven ground to the patio table. Once they were settled, Sheila took a deep breath. "You know, I've been thinking a lot about your situation, about our situation, really." Margaret nodded, bracing herself. "The truth is," Sheila continued, "I've been scared ever since I found you on that bathroom floor. Scared of what could happen if you fall again and no one's here to help." "I know," Margaret said softly. "I've been thinking about options. Maybe one of those assisted living places the doctor mentioned." "No," Sheila interrupted firmly. "That's not what you want, and it's not what I want for you either." She reached into her purse and pulled out a manila envelope, placing it on the table between them. "I have a different idea. But it's big, and I need you to hear me out before you say anything." With slightly trembling hands, Sheila opened the envelope and removed several papers. "You remember I told you about the money I've been saving to open my own bakery someday? Well, I've been thinking about how to use it differently." Margaret's brow furrowed in confusion. "Sheila, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that I've put a down payment on a piece of land just outside town. It's not big, just half an acre, but it's flat, with good soil." Sheila's words came faster now, as if she feared losing courage. "There's an old garage on the property that can be converted into a small guest house. One level, wide doorways, accessible bathroom." She slid a set of architectural drawings across the table. "David helped me find a contractor who specializes in accessible housing. It won't be fancy, but it'll be safe. And it'll be yours for as long as you need it." Margaret stared at the drawings, speechless. The small house in the sketches was simple but thoughtfully designed, every detail considered for someone in a wheelchair. "I don't understand," she finally whispered. "You're giving up your bakery dream for me?" Sheila reached across the table to take Margaret's hand. I'm not giving up anything. I'm just changing the plan a little. The main house on the property will be for me and Peter. David's moving out next month anyway, getting his own place with Lisa before the wedding. But your savings will stretch further with 2 people contributing, Sheila said firmly. You'll pay what you can in rent, just like you do here. The difference is, I'll be next door instead of across town if you need help. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. I never wanted to be a charity case, Sheila. And you're not, Sheila insisted. This isn't charity. It's friendship. It's family, the kind we choose for ourselves. She squeezed Margaret's hand. Besides, who's going to teach Peter all those fancy baking techniques if you move to some facility across town? That boy's got talent, but he needs guidance. A laugh bubbled up through Margaret's tears. You've thought of everything, haven't you? Sheila smiled, relief washing over her face. Not everything, just the important stuff. So, what do you say? Want to be neighbors? As Margaret looked at the woman across from her, this extraordinary ordinary woman who had transformed her life with coffee refills and sugar packets and unquestioning friendship, she knew there was only one possible answer. Summer arrived with a buzz of activity. The half-acre property Sheila had purchased became a weekend gathering spot for what felt like half the town. David brought co-workers from the auto shop to help clear brush and level ground. Peter's college friends showed up with wheelbarrows and shovels. Even Tom from the diner closed early on Sundays to lend a hand with the construction. I never expected all this, Margaret said one Saturday afternoon as she watched the transformation from her wheelchair under the shade of an old oak tree. The skeleton of her future home was taking shape. The converted garage now had new windows, a ramp instead of steps, and widened doorways. Sheila handed her a glass of lemonade and sat down in a folding chair beside her. People want to help. You've touched more lives than you realize. It was true. Over the years, many regular customers at the diner had gotten to know Margaret through her twice-weekly visits. They'd seen how Sheila treated her, not with pity but with genuine friendship. And when word spread about Sheila's plan, offers of help had poured in. The local hardware store donated paint. A retired plumber installed an accessible shower and lowered sink fixtures at cost. The high school woodworking class built custom cabinets with pull-out shelves that Margaret could reach from her wheelchair. I don't know what to say, Margaret murmured, watching 2 teenage boys carefully measuring boards for the new deck. Why would all these people do this for someone they barely know? Because that's what community means, Sheila replied simply. Besides, they're not just doing it for you. They're doing it for themselves too. Margaret looked confused and Sheila explained. People need to feel useful, to know they're making a difference. You're giving them that chance. As the weeks passed, Margaret found herself drawn into the project in ways she hadn't expected. Her teacher's instincts resurfaced as she helped Peter and his friends with the garden layout, explaining which plants would thrive in sun versus shade. When they discovered her knowledge of carpentry, a hobby from her pre-accident life, she became the go-to person for questions about joints and measurements. You've got a good eye, said Frank, a gruff electrician who'd volunteered his weekend to wire the guest house. Sure you weren't a contractor in a previous life? Margaret laughed. Just a teacher who liked to build bookshelves in her spare time. By late August, both houses were nearing completion. The main house wasn't fancy, a simple 3-bedroom ranch style with a big kitchen for Sheila and a study space for Peter. But Margaret's guest house was something special. Every detail had been carefully considered for accessibility and independence. The day before the final inspections, Sheila asked Margaret to join her for a private tour. They hadn't been inside for 2 weeks, as the finishing touches were added. Close your eyes, Sheila instructed as she pushed Margaret's wheelchair up the gently sloping ramp. This feels silly, Margaret protested with a laugh. Humor me, Sheila insisted, positioning the wheelchair just inside the doorway. Okay, open them. Margaret gasped. The small space had been transformed into a home more perfect than she could have imagined. The living area was open and airy, with large windows letting in natural light. The kitchen counters were at the perfect height for her wheelchair, with space underneath to pull up close. Built-in shelves lined the walls at accessible heights. But what took her breath away were the personal touches. On one wall hung a quilt Margaret recognized from her own bedroom, the one her grandmother had made. Beside it was a framed photo of young Margaret in her teacher's office, surrounded by smiling students. "How did you?" "David helped me get some things from your house," Sheila explained. "We wanted it to feel like home from day one." Tears welled in Margaret's eyes as she wheeled herself slowly through the space, taking in every detail. The bathroom had a roll-in shower with a bench and grab bars. The bedroom had a special lowered closet rod and a bed at the perfect height for transfers from her wheelchair. But the most surprising feature was in the corner of the living room, a small desk with a computer. "What's this for?" Margaret asked. Sheila smiled mysteriously. "That's part 2 of my plan. But first," she pulled an envelope from her pocket and handed it to Margaret. "Read this." With trembling fingers, Margaret opened the envelope and unfolded the note inside. "Dear Margaret," it began in Sheila's neat handwriting. "Some people come into our lives when we least expect it but need it most. You walked into the diner looking for breakfast, but what you really gave me was perspective. I watched you face every challenge with grace and determination. You never asked for help even when you needed it most. I realized something important through knowing you, that true strength isn't about handling everything alone. It's about letting others in, creating a community of support where everyone gives what they can and receives what they need. This home is yours for as long as you want it. The keys are yours too. All I ask is that you use them not just to open doors but to open possibilities. I've enrolled you in an online certification program for teaching. The computer is set up and ready. There are kids at the community center who need tutoring, kids who could benefit from your gifts as a teacher. Peter has already spread the word with his college friends who are studying education. This isn't charity, it's investment in you, in our community, and in the friendship that has changed both our lives. Your friend always, Sheila." Margaret looked up, speechless. Sheila stood nervously, waiting for a reaction. "You think I can teach again?" Margaret finally whispered. "I know you can," Sheila said firmly. "Those kids at the community center don't care if their tutor uses a wheelchair. They just need someone who can explain math problems and believe in them. Someone exactly like you." Margaret stared at the keys in her hand, simple metal objects that somehow represented so much more. Independence, purpose, future. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you for this," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Sheila knelt beside the wheelchair and took Margaret's hands in hers. "That's just it. You don't have to. That's what I've been trying to tell you all along. This isn't about debt or repayment. It's about connection. About recognizing that we're all just people trying to make our way, and sometimes the greatest gift we can give each other is the chance to start again." Outside, they could hear the sounds of people arriving, David's truck pulling up, Peter's voice calling out to friends. Tomorrow would be a celebration, a housewarming with the entire community that had come together to create this miracle. But tonight, in this quiet moment, it was just the two of them, a waitress and her customer, a teacher and her student, two women whose chance meeting had blossomed into something neither could have imagined. Two lives, once separate, now intertwined in the best possible way. 2 years passed like the turning of pages in a well-loved book. The small half-acre property had transformed into a place of beauty and purpose. Flower gardens bloomed between the main house and guest house. A vegetable patch provided fresh produce throughout the growing season. On warm evenings, the shed patio became a gathering spot for friends and family. Margaret sat on that patio one autumn afternoon, watching children run across the lawn. 6 of them had come for their twice-weekly tutoring sessions. From her wheelchair, Margaret guided them through mathematics and reading, history and science. Her small guest house had become known in the community as the learning spot, a place where kids who struggled in traditional classrooms could find patience, understanding, and tailor-made instruction. "Ms. Wilson, look what I made," called out a small boy with glasses too big for his face. He proudly held up a science project, a model of the solar system with planets made from painted styrofoam balls. "That's wonderful, Henry," Margaret replied, her face glowing with the joy she'd rediscovered in teaching. "Bring it closer so I can see the details." From the doorway of the main house, Sheila watched the interaction with a smile. Her once quiet customer had blossomed into a confident mentor, surrounded by children who saw only her gifts, not her wheelchair. Later that evening, after the children had gone home and the dishes from dinner were washed and put away, The two women sat together on the patio, wrapped in light blankets against the autumn chill. "I got a phone call today," Margaret said, her eyes on the emerging stars above. "From the school district." Sheila raised an eyebrow. "Oh? They want me to help develop a training program for teachers working with students who have mobility challenges." Her voice held wonder, as if she still couldn't quite believe it. "They said my perspective as both an educator and someone with disability would be valuable." "Of course it would," Sheila replied matter-of-factly. "Who better to teach them?" Margaret shook her head slowly. 2 years ago, I was a forgotten woman eating breakfast alone, counting pennies and wondering how I'd keep my heat on. Now I'm developing curriculum for the district." She turned to Sheila. "And it's all because you served me eggs." They both laughed at the simplicity of it, how small moments could lead to life-changing ones, how a simple breakfast order had been the first step on this unexpected journey. "It wasn't just about the eggs," Sheila said after a moment. "It was about seeing you, really seeing you." The next morning, Sheila was at the diner as usual, pouring coffee and taking orders. Her position had changed over the past 2 years. Joe had made her manager, giving her more flexible hours so she could balance work with her new living arrangement. But she still insisted on working the floor several days a week. "Can't manage what you're not willing to do yourself," she always said. The bell above the door jingled, and Sheila looked up to see a familiar face. Frank, the electrician who had worked on Margaret's guest house. "Morning, Frank." "The usual." He nodded, settling onto a stool at the counter. "And maybe some news with that coffee." Sheila poured his cup, curious. "What kind of news?" "The good kind." Frank sipped his coffee. "Remember how the local paper did that story about you and Margaret? About the community coming together to build her place?" Sheila nodded. The article had run about a year ago, a simple human interest story for the local section. "Well, seems like a producer from one of those TV shows got wind of it. The ones that highlight everyday heroes." He pulled a business card from his pocket and slid it across the counter. "She called me yesterday, asked if I could put her in touch with you two." Sheila stared at the card, her expression unreadable. "It's not just about you and Margaret," Frank continued. "It's about all of us, how this whole town came together. Good news for a change, right?" Later that afternoon, Sheila showed the card to Margaret as they sat at Margaret's kitchen table. "A TV show?" Margaret's eyes widened. "About us?" Sheila shrugged. Apparently our little story struck a chord. Margaret was quiet for a moment, thinking. "Do you want to do it?" "I'm not sure," Sheila admitted. "Never been one for attention. But Frank made a good point. It's not just about us. It's about everyone who pitched in. And maybe," Margaret added softly, "it's about showing people what's possible when someone takes that first step." The producer visited the following week, a friendly woman with quick eyes and a genuine smile. She sat with Sheila and Margaret on their shed patio, listening as they told their story from the beginning. The first breakfast at the diner. The small kindnesses that grew into friendship. The crisis that led to a solution. The community that rallied around them. "What made you do it?" the producer asked Sheila. "Use your bakery savings to create a home for Margaret? That's a significant sacrifice." Sheila glanced at Margaret, then back to the producer. It didn't feel like sacrifice. It felt like investment. In friendship, in community. She paused. "And as for that bakery dream?" She gestured toward the far end of the property where construction had begun on a small outbuilding. "Turns out dreams don't have to die. They just change shape sometimes." The producer looked intrigued. "What's that going to be?" "Sunshine Bakery," Sheila said with a smile. "Opening next spring. Margaret's tutoring business has done so well, she's helping me fund it. We're going to offer job training for kids from the community center. Peter's designing the menu. He graduates from culinary school in December." The TV segment aired 3 months later. Sheila and Margaret watched it together, surrounded by friends and family crowded into the main house living room. The 5-minute piece captured the essence of their story. 2 women from different backgrounds whose lives had intersected in a small-town diner and the extraordinary friendship that followed. When it ended, there was a moment of silence, then applause from their gathered community. David raised his glass in a toast. "To Mom and Margaret, proving that family isn't about blood, it's about love." As glasses clinked and conversations resumed, Sheila and Margaret exchanged a look that said more than words could. Their journey had not been easy. There had been hard days, setbacks, moments of doubt. Margaret still faced daily challenges with her disability. Sheila still worked long hours at the diner. But they had created something precious, a friendship that had expanded into a community, a purpose that had grown from a simple act of kindness, a home built not just of wood and nails, but of shared dreams and mutual support. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, covering their little half-acre in a blanket of white. Inside, the warmth of connection filled every corner. The story that had begun with eggs over easy and open sugar packets had become something neither woman could have imagined, a testament to the extraordinary power of ordinary kindness and to the family we find when we least expect it but need it most.